Hi, welcome back to Kennings Cantrips. I'm Russ,
And I'm Morgan.
and for this episode, we're going to continue our discussion of story pacing. This time, we're going to be talking about the ebook revolution and whether and how that affects the way we structure and pace our stories out.
So we're seeing a lot of changes coming with independent publishing and ebooks and everything. And in the pulp revolution spheres of the web, they're talking a lot about pulp speed. And you see people like Nick Cole saying you need to be dropping another book within, I guess, 60 days of the last one. Do you think
I thought I read a month, but yeah.
Yeah, it might even be a month that, output and speed and everything is really coming to the forefront now, when you don't have to wait to be distributed through the major bookstores, when you don't even really have to be printed because you have the Kindles to release things on. Is this changing story structures a lot, or do we think we're going to mostly stay the same?
I think it's going to mostly stay the same because the things had already moved to having a quicker pace, having you open a story in media res. And I don't think having an ebook changed what people were kind of already wanting in print. Because if we look back at some of the classics, you can't see my fingers doing the quotation marks, classics, they had a lot slower beginnings, and they spent 100 pages just setting the scene. And we don't have books that really do that very often anymore. It's more, let's get the story going right now, get you caught up, get you hooked, and keep going. So stylistically, we've been changing for a long time. I mean, big difference between Fellowship of the Ring and something else that might come out today as far as a big epic fantasy. So I think in that sense, we've changed, but I'm not trying to hog the conversation. I'm sorry.
No, it's okay.
Well, I do think that from the point of view of a professional author, there has to be a trade-off between quantity and quality. You really do need to have, you will starve on one book, unless that's one extraordinarily good and popular and lucky and successful book. You have to keep cranking out books, and doing a series of related characters, related settings, I think is a very effective way to do that, because if you can hook a reader on the characters and the setting in book one, they want to know what happens next, and they will buy book two. And if they like that, they'll buy book three, and so on. And that's the way a professional author can get enough of an income and reader base to be able to support themselves. Now, I find that really hard to do from the point of view of my books, just because there is an enormous amount of research that goes into the history and the physics that are getting woven into my stories. It takes a long time for me to come up with this plausible alternate history and alternate physics that are driving the story. Now, it's actually kind of in the background of the story, but it's tough to make that convincing. And I don't know how I could really pick up the pace in my own writing to meet that kind of, let's publish a new book every 60 days or so. I think it would, even if I were working at it full time, I don't think I would be that much faster, because there's so many places where I'm stuck and I'm having to solve a puzzle and trying to figure out how to work things out and put it all together. So I may have a different perspective on that than most professional writers would.
The only suggestion I could make on that is I have a project. Morgan's heard me talk about it before. I haven't talked about it a lot publicly. I have a project that's been on the back burner for a while because I fully intend to do it, but one of the issues with it is it runs into a similar thing. This is a brief description of it. I ran across, I'm a fan of conspiracy theories. I don't believe in many of them, but I find that they're some of the most entertaining reading you can find. The creativity some of these guys have is amazing.
They're gold mines for fiction.
Oh, they are. They're absolute gold mines for fiction. And that's where this particular idea came from. There's a conspiracy theory out there called the Phantom Time theory. And you can go Google it. It's on Wikipedia and Infogalactic and all that stuff. And it's a German historian in the early part of the 20th century came up with this conspiracy theory that about 300 years worth of history didn't actually happen. One of the German emperors and the Pope at the time entered into a conspiracy to just change the date up ahead by 300 years and hide all this history. Well, of course, I'm a sci-fi and fantasy writer, so I hear all of this, and my first thought is, what if 300 years of time literally went missing? Then ideas start turning in my head. So I have this idea in my head now that is eventually it's going to get written, because it's one of those ideas that you get that will not leave you alone until it gets written. A story involving such characters throughout history as Nikola Tesla, Pope Gregory the Great, and George Washington and King Arthur and Robin Hood, all melded into this multiple timeline and time travel combined story. But the problem with that is exactly what Hans says, is like you get into something that complicated and it does not get written quickly. And so I have a trilogy in mind for that, and it's complex enough that I've already decided when that gets time to write that, I'm outlining it and I have a number of notes, and I will not even start writing a single word on it until I have the outlines for all 3 books, and then it is not getting published until all 3 books are done, because it's too complex, and if I go change something in the middle of book 2, it might break everything I wrote in book 1. So it's that kind of a project. But the one thing that could be done with a project like that to meet the every 30 to 60 day release window is actually exactly what I just said, which is to write them all ahead of time and then stagger the release by 30 to 60 days. And it doesn't actually make the writing any faster, but it could make the financial side of it significantly better if you release it that way. So, for whatever that idea is worth. I do also happen to know that that's a little bit what Nick Cole and Jason Ansbach did with their current series that is doing so well, is that they had 2 books completely written before they released the first one, and they were a good chunk of the way into the third one. So
it's a winning strategy I hear a lot about.
Yeah, and that's part of the reason they're able to release so many so quickly. I'm actually planning to do that probably with my next series after I finish the current one, is to write the first 2 books completely before I release either of them. I think that's a useful tactic. As getting back a little bit on subject with the changing to structure, what are you guys' thoughts on the length of works? Obviously, the longer works people tend to like better, but shorter works you can get done more quickly. So do you guys have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I really like short novels. Now, I hold like the Heinlein juveniles as being just the perfect length, where you have a lot of action and a lot of plot twists, and somehow you manage to get it all done in 60, maybe 80, maybe 100,000 words, but not much more than that. I've just seen too many books by authors that I really like that it seems like they've started to get paid by the word, and they just drag on and on and on with soap opera-esque detail of all of these interactions between characters that don't really advance the plot, and it takes forever to actually get anything concrete done. And I really hate writing like that, and I don't want to deliver something like that. I try very hard to pack as much action, as many plot twists as possible in as short a work as I can write.
I've been working on this myself. I mean, my first one was crazy long, and since then I've started, thinking about what do I feel like writing. And I wrote a 75,000 word novel that I thought, oh, this feels a little short, but that was okay. And then I started pondering it, especially the way the e-market is going, that yeah, why don't I do shorter works that are more akin to the books I grew up reading, the Louis L'Amours, with how thin those are, the sword and sorcery novels of the 60s and 70s that I still love to grab if I can find them in used bookstores. That was part of my plan for my Weird Western series that I released book 1 in January. That book I was shooting for 60,000 words, and it still ended up at 81,000. So it was bigger than I thought. And then the sequel, I just did it with however I felt right about it. And that one came out at 40,000 words. And I just released it at that. And that was plenty good for me. So I kind of made up my mind that the third for the trilogy will just be whatever I feel like. I'm sure it'll be at least 40. When it comes to the marketing end of it, sometimes people are looking for longer books, but sometimes they're looking for shorter books. And the one thing that leaves me torn on doing a bunch of 40,000 word novels is that having them in Amazon's KU, you get paid by the page reads. And I am making more money right now this month, I'm pretty sure, from page reads than I am from actual sales.
That's a really good point that feeds into it. The 40,000 word novel is interesting because I've had chats with Morgan. It's not the direction I'm going at the moment, but I have seriously considered it for future work. I've been calling it novellas at that length, but really about that length of 50,000 word novels. I'm becoming fairly convinced that there's a business model to be had there because you could put them out so quickly. But they're still large enough that you can get away with charging the $2.99 price on Amazon that gives you 70% royalties.
Yeah.
And by hitting that break almost exactly, you can get them out quickly. Like, I feel like if I were working full-time at it, which I'm not at the moment, I have a day job as well, but I feel like if I were working full-time at it, that I could probably actually put out a 40,000 word novel every 60 to 90 days and keep that going. I hadn't really thought about the Kindle Unlimited part because I do see that some of our books actually get almost as much. Some of our books through Silver Empire get either almost as much or sometimes even more money from Kindle Unlimited from page reads than they get from a straight up sale. So there's definitely a trade-off there. That's a good thing to think about.
Yeah, it's like Kindle Unlimited never made me anything until this year when I started my first Weird Western, and that took off. And I was like, oh, wow. Why haven't I been doing this the whole time? Because suddenly I'm making double the money I was expecting, and that's awesome. Not as much as I'd like yet, but it's a good start.
Yeah,
and it's like I was shooting to make that new fantasy I just released, Brutal. I was shooting for 60,000 words, and it ended up at 78. So great. Because I still feel like it's a stripped down, quick paced action read. It's not no padding or dress shopping there. Dress shopping is how I referred to the Wheel of Time books.
I know, I don't know the direct numbers because through Silver Empire, Russell keeps closer tabs on that, but I know that I actually get a lot of reads on Kindle Unlimited for my School of Spells and War series. But since they're a collection of short stories and novellas, the longest one being around 22,000 words, it doesn't add up to much because it's not a whole lot of pages, even when they're reading all of them.
Mm-hmm.
What we have definitely noticed with that, though, and this is very consistent with what other people have said, is that the modern culture is very much of a I've heard it compared to the Netflix binge-watching culture, that going back to having series out there, that people really like to find a series where they can just sit down and read the entire series one after the other. And we have definitely found with the works we've put out that having even one sequel really improves the sales of the first one, and having more than one has an even bigger jump. Like it definitely matters. Even with the short stories, it was very obvious when we started having more out.
Yeah, definitely. I've seen a good jump once I put out book 2 in my series.
Yeah, I saw that same jump when I did my sequel. In fact, this first month that my sequel has been out, I'm closing in on in the entire first year that my original book was out. So having a sequel has been really huge for me.
It's interesting too. Talking about sequels and page length, I'm going to jump back in the conversation a little bit. We were talking about the Heinlein juvenile novels. One of the things that's interesting is that as with so many other things that we've discussed tonight, and that in the circles we travel on social media, a lot of people have been discussing, it's interesting how much things are actually going back old school. The older novels in the early part of the 20th century largely were much, much shorter than what we do now. They got longer and longer. It seems like throughout my lifetime, mostly. Like when I was a child, the shorter novels, I didn't track page count as a kid, word count as a kid, but you can see the pages, like 150 page novel was pretty normal, maybe 200. Whereas, certainly in the fantasy genre now, at least, you go out there and a 400 or 500 page novel is pretty standard. But it seems like online, the trend is starting to move back the other direction, back towards about the length of the older novels. And I wonder if it isn't similar market forces at work now, where it's just the quantity matters, and being able to get them done helps a lot.
There's some definite benefits, because it's stuff that I've read is, in sci-fi, people were just loving and clamoring for more space marine type stuff. And yet the trade publishers just can't put it out fast enough. And that niche has just been filled up with indies who are feeding that need. And that's what makes doing indie stuff now so exciting, is that you can just jump on something if it's working out for you. My first novel was traditionally published, and I remember going to conferences in 2009 or so. We'd have agents there, and people would always get up and say, don't follow trends, because by the time you write your novel and get it submitted and get it to an agent and blah, 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 the trend is going to change. Kindle's destroyed the old advice.
Well, yeah, because if you can get a novel done in even 6 months, that's enough time. If you can get it written in 6 months now, it's not like the old days where you had to wait another year before it was out on the shelves. If you can get it done in 6 months, you can have it on Amazon in 7 easily, probably 6.5 really, if you can get it done in 6. So chasing the trends is not bad advice. And if you're doing a shorter novel and can get it done in 3 or 4 months, then you could absolutely chase the trends. And that's a business model I could also see working for somebody who had the output to keep up with it, is just to watch the trends very closely and say, hey, that's hot right now, I'm going to go write one of those.
Yeah, I'm convinced there's loads of writers out there that are saying, this is hot, I'm going to do this. And I can understand how they're doing it, but for me, it's like, I'm still going to write what I want to write and try to package it as good as I can so that people will want it and buy it. Because, like you said, with series, I've already went and bought 6 covers to brand in a series, so that I will have 6 books minimum in my what'll become my Cell Swords series of fantasy books. And it's like, okay, this is my plan so that I can quit that day job.
And it's funny because I haven't quite made the jump on that, but I've already been talking to several folks, and I'm planning to go ahead and pick up covers probably for the rest of my current series, which is a trilogy. And then the next series I'm going to write is actually featuring the subset of the same characters, so it has a heavy overlap. And I've already gone out and started outlining the entire series and going from there. And may well pick up several of those covers ahead of time as well. You get some advantages when you pick them up early, which is that when book 1 is finished, I can already have that cover for book 2 and an ad for it at the end, and possibly even a sample chapter or whatever ready to go.
Yeah, definitely.
And for it. And so, yeah, I've been thinking along very similar lines already and moving toward that. Definitely see where you're heading with that.
And that's it for 2.4. I hope you enjoyed it. We will be back for our last episode about story pacing, where we'll talk about the length of a book, how trad publishing does and doesn't affect a book length, and just a little bit of general conversation to finish up the topic.